This is BBC Two. And now it's time for the news with Moira Stewart.
And from the newsroom, the main stories at 2 o'clock. The number of people out of work has gone up, but the underlying trend for unemployment is down. Government statistics show a rise in the overall figure for September of more than 4,000, but the seasonally adjusted total fell by nearly 54,000. The government's announced it's selling off its BP shares for £3.30 each, a discount of about 20 pence on the current price. The sale's expected to raise almost £6 billion. Avon and Somerset police say a 24-year-old man has been charged with murder following yesterday's shooting in Bristol. Kevin Weaver from Redfield in Bristol is due in court this afternoon. He's accused of shooting 2 men at a clothing factory. 20 Indian soldiers have been killed by a landmine planted by Tamil separatists in Sri Lanka. It came as the Indian troops continue to battle for control of Tamil strongholds in the Jaffna Peninsula. Our next news, 3 o'clock.
Good afternoon, Stuart. It's just started to rain yet again here in the London area, and it does look as if we're in for a spell of pretty wet weather once again. In fact, before the afternoon's out, that rain will have got into East Anglia, the whole of South East England, many southern parts of Wales, and all the rest of the south of England as well, and some really wet weather in store.
And emergency services are at full stretch, so if you don't have to go out at all this morning, please stay at home. Well, it seems to have taken everybody by surprise, this weather, but we've got Martin Rowley on the phone, hopefully from the London Weather Centre, who can tell us exactly what's going on. Good morning, Martin.
Good morning, UK.
Good morning. What happened?
Yes, well, we got a really vicious little low-pressure area developed in the Bay of Biscay last night. It was actually as we were starting our duty about 8 o'clock yesterday evening, and really the bottom just fell out of this little depression. It just sort of caught itself up in its own circulation and just picked up its skirts and really headed in our direction, deepening all the time. We've reached our record low pressure here in the here at the London Weather Centre. We've also had our strongest gust as well, and really it's all down to that really nasty little low pressure area. We were thinking that there might be some sort of strength to the wind, but we certainly not expecting anything like the fearsome winds that have turned up overnight, Kate.
When was the last time we saw weather anything like as bad as this?
Well, as you appreciate, I haven't had much time to delve into the record books because we've been inundated with calls, but I think we've really got to go back, a good 10 to 15 years to get anything quite as widespread and quite as devastating, and perhaps even longer than that. It's certainly not something that we would expect more than once every sort of 15 or 20 years or so, Kate.
We believe it's actually heading northeast towards Yorkshire now. Is that the case?
That's right. What's happening is that a little nasty little thing that's caused all the bother is heading out into the North Sea. On the way, it's going to squeeze up the winds across much of northern England, and particularly parts of Yorkshire, especially up over the high ground. Now, the good news for people in the north is that you won't get quite such the really fearsome gusts that we've had down in the south. It seems to be southern Britain, once again, that's caught the brunt of the bad weather this month. In the north, yes, it will get windier, perhaps not quite so windy, though, as we have down here at the moment, Kate.
Have we seen the last of it in the southeast now, though?
Well, it's going to be a slow process. What's happening in the present picture is that through East Anglia and Kent, still some fearsome winds coming from the south. And then if you can imagine the rest of the country, the winds are coming in more from the west. As those winds switch over, there's going to be a gusty period, a real squally period. And then very slowly, later in the morning, into the afternoon, everything settling down a little bit. It'll still be a windy day, but those really fearsome gusts will have gone away, I should think, by about the early afternoon from most of Britain, Kate.
And for the weekend, what's likely to happen? Will it build up again?
Prior to then, it's still to be some windy weather in the west and north, but it's more the traditional windy weather, really, gusts of sort of 40, 45 miles an hour. And certainly for areas that have had the battering overnight, it looks as though we've got a spell of quiet weather over the weekend with a little bit of sunshine.
Martin Rowley from the London Weather Centre, thanks very much indeed for joining us this morning. Well, to get the latest update on the weather, let's go over to our own weatherboard now, and Tricia.
Thanks very much, Kay, and good morning. Well, as Martin just mentioned and Gordon was telling you earlier, weather records of the worst kind have been broken last night and this morning. Gusts of 95 miles an hour, the record for London, have been taking place and still are. And the pressure dropped to 963 millibars, that's 28.4 inches. Now, the system, first of all, moved across towards Birmingham.
Well, the rest of the country is with us once again. The picture this morning is that southern and central England are coping as best they can this morning with some of the worst weather in recent memory. Storms have battered those parts of Britain, south and central England, during the night. There are reports of winds of up to very nearly 100 miles an hour. There is damage in many parts of the country. Roads, railways are blocked. The advice to people is not to try to go to work, to stay at home. Now, we do have reports of casualties. One of the worst affected areas of the country this morning has been the south coast, and I think we do now have a report from Southampton. Our reporter there is Gaynor Scott.
High winds reaching more than 100 miles an hour have been sweeping the south and bringing chaos to all parts of the region. Police say don't travel or leave your home unless it's an emergency, and all the emergency services are being stretched to the limit. At Christchurch in Dorset, 2 firemen have died. They'd been called to an emergency. They were leaving to deal with another call when their fire engine was hit by a falling tree. At Waterlooville in Hampshire, 30 people have been forced to leave their homes. 2 houses have collapsed and the residents have taken shelter in a local community centre. At Barton-on-Sea, a man has been rescued after being trapped on the 2nd floor of a block of flats which has partially collapsed. Emergency services now rescued him. The Isle of Wight is one of the areas hardest hit. Most of the roads are blocked by falling trees, and there's a danger of flooding in West Wight. Heavy seas and high winds have caused part of Shanklin Pier to collapse. There's a rescue operation going on at Hayling Island, where a person has become trapped. At Brighton in Sussex, a house has collapsed in Western Road, and most of the windows in the main shopping area have been blown out. No trains are running on the southern region of British Rail, and there are trees across the line in the western region. This is Gaynor Scott at BBC Television News in Southampton.
Well, that's the position in the south of England. In East Anglia, there's been widespread flooding in the Norwich area, and some villages in East Anglia, we understand, are now cut off. Many roads in that part of the country are blocked, as indeed, of course, they are across most of southern and central England. The position is better in the West Country, but there have been high winds in the Plymouth area, and trees have blocked many roads there as well. On the Channel Islands, winds of 110 miles an hour have been reported. So far, the Midlands have escaped the worst of the storms, but the wind is now picking up in central England. Well, the worst of the weather has affected the south. London has been battered during the night. The people of London are now waking up to scenes of considerable damage, scenes of considerable problems. The advice to you in London, and indeed if you're in many parts of southern or central England, is not to venture out very far. Don't try to go to work if such a journey involves many miles. Trains are not running in the south of England, and neither are air services from Gatwick, we understand. We don't yet have a report on the situation at Heathrow. Now, I should apologise at this stage for this rather rudimentary service which we're bringing you in place of breakfast time. Our breakfast time studios are out of action this morning. Electricity supplies are down in much of London and indeed in other parts of the southeast. Those services are being restored as and when it is possible. Now, I understand that we can go to the Midlands for a report on conditions there.
So far, the Midlands seems to have missed the worst of the bad weather, though in the past hour the winds have begun to increase in the region. There's been minor flooding in Nottinghamshire and Leicestershire, but further west in South Cheshire, a row of cottages were flooded when a canal overflowed near Sandbach. British Rail have warned passengers that they travel south at their own risk. In the East Midlands, there's a local service getting through to Bedford, and attempts are being made to run a service from Wolverhampton through to Birmingham as far as Watford. There are some delays to flights at both Birmingham and East Midlands airports, mainly due to difficulties at Heathrow and Gatwick. So to sum up the position in the Midlands, the region has so far got off lightly.
Well, the Midlands getting off lightly, that's the news from there, but that's certainly not the picture in the south or some of central England, just north of southern England. The position in London is that the London Fire Brigade has received 2,600 emergency calls this morning. They say that they are able to cope with those calls. They are offering an emergency service, though they are having to concentrate on the caring institutions, and what the prognosis for the rest of the day is.
The situation is, Nick, that the bad weather system which came up through the south coast in the middle of the night is now moving across into Derbyshire and into northeast England. The strongest winds are on the eastern side of that low pressure system, so obviously it's the south of England, the southeast, East Anglia that's seen the worst of that strong wind so far. The winds are going to be taken away into the North Sea. The very stormy winds will be taken away in the next few hours. In fact, most places already probably seen the winds abating to some extent. But as the wind swings round to the west or northwest, it's still going to be very windy. It'll be a very squally wind. We've got more heavy showers to come. I mean, there's a lot of heavy rain around now across East Anglia, the Midlands, and up into northern England, running into southern Scotland. As that heavy rain begins to move away very slowly northwards, still some squally showers coming in behind, so it's a pretty terrible day, really, across many parts of the country.
You were saying that there was a gust of 94 miles an hour recorded, I think, at the London Weather Centre.
That's right.
We have this report now of winds in excess of 100 miles an hour in the Channel Islands. A gust of 110 miles an hour reported there. Just, I mean, that is remarkable, isn't it?
Well, it is. It is. We get these every now and again. We get the very, very strong gusts up to 100 miles an hour around the coast. It may just happen three times a year. Somewhere, one rogue report, 100 miles an hour. But this is widespread. You know, we're not talking about one small coast guard. We're talking about places right along the south coast, probably, right the way up through south east and East Anglia, where the gusts have been up to 80, 90, possibly 100 miles an hour. And who's to say? We don't have these anemometer masts everywhere. You can get some very, very strong funneling effects in different types of countryside, different types of townscapes, if you like, where you get very, very strong funneling of winds between buildings. These are the things that knock down the telegraph posts and the trees, etc., etc.
But that is now moving away from the south, and I think you're saying that the storms are now heading up the country towards the northeast.
Yes, they're not going to be as strong, but it will be very windy over northern England and perhaps parts of south and east Scotland. One thing that's not been really said too much so far is the fact that we've had a lot of rain as well, some heavy rain, some thunder too, a lot of rain across East Anglia, flooding as well.
John, thank you. We can now go to breakfast time and to Jeremy Paxman.
Welcome to breakfast time. If you've been wondering where we were earlier this morning, I have to tell you the answer is submerged in darkness in our studio in West London. We've transferred to this one at very last moment. The whole of southern England, let me tell you, is in chaos this morning after some of the worst overnight weather in living memory. There's been a massive power cut in London. Fallen trees are littering hundreds of roads, and there have been a number of fatal accidents. Here's Jeremy now with the details.
Well, as Sally was saying, hurricane-force winds have hit the south and the central parts of England. They've blown down power lines, trees, they've blocked roads, train services have been disrupted, all trains have been cancelled in the southern and eastern regions. The Midland and western regions are also badly hit. Worst affected areas are Dorset, Wiltshire and the Isle of Wight. 2 firemen were killed when they were crushed by a falling tree. The Shanklin Pier on the Isle of Wight has been blown away. In Hampshire, a woman was rescued when a block of flats collapsed at Barton-on-Sea, and another block of flats collapsed at Waterlooville. People in London have been advised to stay indoors. Extra police have been brought in Southampton to deal with problems caused by the strong winds. Many major roads are blocked. The West Country hasn't been so badly hit, although high winds have brought down trees in the Plymouth area. And on the Channel Islands, winds are reported to have reached 110 miles an hour. In the London area, police have warned people not to travel unless absolutely necessary, and all major roads are blocked. There's also been problems in East Anglia. Widespread floodings reported in the Norwich area. Some villages have been cut off. Our reporter Mike Mackay has been able to get some indication of what conditions are like here in central London. Mike, what can you tell us?
Well, Jeremy, as you say, the damage is certainly very severe in London. We came across cars crushed beneath trees, scaffolding collapsed, and not only, of course, are many of the streets blocked by major obstacles, but all sorts of small debris have littered the streets. Leaves from the trees have covered the road so that they're very dangerous and greasy. Things like bollards have been blown down, lamp standards.
I think we've got some pictures of some of the scenes you saw this morning, which should just be coming up on the screen. Perhaps you could just talk us through them when they come up now. Here we are.
Indeed, we have in central London. Oxford Street took a battering by the way. Major shops had their storefronts blown out. What happened? And here you can see a man who escaped with his life, and indeed his dogs escaped with him when a tree collapsed on top of his car. Elsewhere, a very expensive car was crushed by falling masonry and scaffolding in a part of Belgravia. Fortunately, again, no one was in the vehicle, but all of this damage, of course, has been going on during the night when the streets are in central London. Oxford Street took quite a battering during the night. Major stores had their shop fronts blown out, and one of our reporters spoke to a bus worker.
We got trees down all the way along the embankment, down all through the West End and everything. Down part of Park Lane is closed up, Whitehall, part of that is closed. We're getting them down as quick as we can to get the buses out as quick as we can. We're going around at the moment to try and tell everybody and let them know that we are getting the buses out to them as quick as possible.
Damage was very severe in the area. Trees have come tumbling down during very high gale force winds which gusted up to 110 miles an hour in some parts of the country. Buildings have been badly damaged. As I said earlier, scaffolding in many areas has come tumbling down, crushing and damaging cars, but fortunately not many reports of people being injured.
Badly affected. The worst hit areas have been Dorset, Wiltshire and the Isle of Wight. 2 firemen were killed when they were crushed by a falling tree. The Shanklin Pier on the Isle of Wight has been blown away. In Hampshire, a woman was rescued when a block of flats collapsed at Barton-on-Sea and another block of flats collapsed at Waterlooville. The Queen's Hotel has collapsed in Hastings. Firemen there are searching for a number of guests who are missing. A woman has been killed by a falling tree at Windsor. A man has been trapped in the rubble of a house on Hayling Island in Hampshire. Several caravan sites have been severely damaged along the south coast. People at 3 sites at Peacehaven in Sussex and at Selsey have been evacuated. They're being housed temporarily in church halls. There's been a major gas fracture at Headley Down near Borden in Hampshire. Extra police have been brought in Southampton to deal with the problems caused by the strong winds there. Many major roads across southern England are blocked. The West Country, though, has not been so badly affected, although high winds have brought down many trees in the Plymouth area. On the Channel Islands, winds are reported to have reached 110 miles an hour. In the London area, police have warned people not to travel unless absolutely necessary, and all major roads into the capital are blocked. The advice from the travel services, therefore, is not to travel unless it is absolutely necessary. There have also been problems in East Anglia. There is widespread flooding reported in the Norwich area. Some villages in East Anglia have been cut off. We're just hearing also that a building in Brighton has collapsed and efforts are being made there to recover the people who are inside the building. So the picture this morning is of considerable chaos and damage across southern and parts of central England. We do have some pictures, I think, from central London of the situation in the capital this morning. Many trees at the moment. We're now going back to Jeremy Paxman in the Breakfast Time studio.
Thanks, Nick. Now, a woman who for almost a decade has been fighting to clear her son's name in this morning. Well, now, normally about this time we bring you the weather forecast. If you live in the south of England, you'll need to do no more than look out of the window to realise it's not worth going outside today. And, of course, we can't bring you any satellite pictures, maps or anything else because we ain't got no electricity for them. So, Mr. Ketley, tell us what it's going to do.
So I'm all on my own, am I, Jeremy? Well, the truth of the matter is that the worst of the weather at the moment is over the Midlands and running into northern England. That's where the worst of the rain is anyway. The heaviest winds, the strong winds, the hurricane force winds are beginning to move away from eastern parts of England into the North Sea. So I suppose now we can only get better. Things are gradually beginning to improve, but still a fair amount of rain across the country. What we're going to find is that many places become brighter from the west as the day goes along. Some brighter weather coming through. I'm not saying much sunshine, probably not at all. But there will be some squally showers to come through as well. The winds, though, still pretty noticeable. There are going to be some strong winds right throughout the day. They're going to gradually moderate, though, in many parts of the country. In actual fact, let's be fair about it, parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland have seen very little so far. The winds there have been really quite light. A lot of cloud around, some patchy rain too. But gradually you're going to find the winds do freshen up a little bit in southern and eastern parts of Scotland. The wind's getting stronger up there as the day goes along. But those strong winds never actually getting as far as western Scotland and Northern Ireland. A bit of a breeze, yes, but really they're going to be let off pretty lightly. Now all this stuff's going to get out of the way later on today. We're going to find that things get a lot better. So for the weekend, we can talk about much better prospects. The strong winds will certainly have gone by then. We're going to find quite a lot of squally showers, though, coming through. Well, heavy showers, really. The winds won't be as strong. There'll be some sunshine as well. But late in the day on Saturday, I think we're going to find some rain getting into parts of southwest England, Wales, Northern Ireland, that sort of area. And then during the weekend, that rain gradually moving northeastwards across the country. I don't think the rain's going to be particularly heavy, but there'll be a fair amount of it about, and the winds will once again pick up, especially in northwestern parts of Britain. Now, down in the southeastern quarter of the country, things quite a bit different there, quite a bit brighter. The best of the weather, Jeremy.
Thanks, John. Well, if you live in those areas affected by the terrible weather, the advice in many of those areas is don't go out unless you absolutely have to. It is now 8:30, and let's join Nick Witchell, who has the news headlines.
Well, we're now starting to get a better idea of Southern England during the night.
Last night's closed down weather summary.
Well, that's what the situation was like earlier on this evening. It's associated with this quite deep low pressure area, and a few days ago we thought it would be coming a little bit further west, bringing the strong winds right across the country, but now it looks as though most of those strong winds will stay away, although it's still going to be very breezy up through the Channel and on the eastern side of the country.
Because the weathermen had discounted the storm, they weren't able to warn the emergency services. The London Fire Brigade said the first they knew was a warning at 3 o'clock of winds of 40 miles an hour, possibly gusting higher. The ambulance service said they had no warning at all. What went wrong?
It took the country by surprise. The question is, why? At the headquarters of the Met Office at Bracknell in Berkshire, weathermen had seen something was brewing as long ago as last Sunday. But then there was no indication of just what was in store. By noon on Wednesday, the depression in mid-Atlantic seemed innocuous enough. By 6 p.m. it had moved east, warm air from the Azores being forced upwards, creating the depression beneath it. By 6 o'clock yesterday morning, two separate centres had formed and the depression had started to deepen as it entered the Bay of Biscay. By noon yesterday, the two centres began to merge, making it more intense. By 6 o'clock last night, the storm had gathered strength, forming itself into a spinning top of turbulence. By midnight, the storm centre was west of the Channel Islands. The depression suddenly deepened, whipping up some of the fiercest winds Britain has seen. Wind speeds averaging 75 miles an hour are hurricane force. That happens in America, where gusts reach 140 miles an hour and more. In London, there were gusts of 94 miles an hour, the average winds being storm force. At the London Weather Centre, the blue gauge registered the 94-mile-an-hour gust on the roof. Another wind gauge on the British Telecom tower was blown away. The readings just gave up. Experts today said it's not the Met Office's fault. They didn't foresee it earlier. This type of depression is notoriously difficult to forecast accurately. The weather in the upper atmosphere can be monitored with so-called upper air stations, weather balloons. Britain has 8 of these stations, not sufficient to forecast what happened last night. It was such a rare event that equipping the Met men to monitor it accurately would simply be too expensive.
Well, joining me now from the London Weather Centre is the BBC's weather forecaster, Ian McCaskill. Well, Ian, you chaps were a fat lot of good last night.
Well, we have been forecasting high winds and gales relentlessly since Sunday. I admit, we weren't forecasting hurricane force winds, and that's what we got, and that's what we will get maybe once every 50 years, maybe once a lifetime. We haven't worked out the figures just yet.
Well, yes, but your weather forecast at midnight last night talks about a rather windy, showery airflow, blustering bursts of showery rain. No kidding. I mean, if you can't forecast the worst storms for several centuries 3 hours before they happen, what are you doing?
Well, we did forecast it rather more than 3 hours before it happened. Unfortunately, that was around midnight, a bit late to tell people. We told everybody we could think of.
Well, I was talking to the ambulance centre this morning and they didn't get any warning at all.
We didn't tell the ambulance people. They didn't ask us to.
Well, yes, all right. But how bad was it, Ian, in relation to what's gone on in the past? I mean, was this really a sort of record-breaking storm?
The oldest people around here, and that's me, can't remember anything like it at all. We're starting to look in history books. We'll find a storm that looks like it in 1703. Now, there have been other stormy periods since then, Michael, but very little stronger than that, and not in the London area. We are quite confident that this is the strongest thing we can find for many, many years in London.
Well, are you weathermen just shrugging your shoulders as a result of all this, or is there an inquest going on down there at the Weather Centre?
Well, there is at this very minute, and there will be for the next several months. We are getting better and better. This one, just stronger than we thought.
Ian McCaskill, thanks very much. Oh, just very quickly, what's it going to be looking like? I mean, is this petering out, or is other people going to get it?
Yes, no, it's moving north. There are still gales in Lincolnshire and in Norfolk as well, but they are gradually moderating, and these winds will not return tonight. They will not return over the weekend.
Ian McCaskill, thanks very much indeed. Well, listening to all that is
Tom and
Peter
Regine
Bottomley,
crossed the Irish Sea for a practice honeymoon in Wales in foreign bodies. At 9:30 on 1, a stuntman is injured during the filming of Pulaski, with serious implications for actor Larry. Pulaski is in half an hour on BBC One.
The 9 o'clock news from the BBC with Martin Lewis and Philip Hayton.
Die as hurricane-force winds sweep southern Britain. Railways and roads are blocked. Hundreds of thousands stay off work. The trail of havoc from coast to coast.
The missile attack on a US-flagged tanker. How will America respond to what she calls an outrageous act of Iranian aggression?
The First Lady goes into hospital tonight to be tested for breast cancer.
And how the United States keeps watch on the Soviets' top-secret missile tests.
Good evening. Southern Britain is clearing up after the worst night of storms since records began almost 300 years ago. 13 people died in the gales, which took weathermen by surprise and wrecked hundreds of homes. Most of those killed were hit by trees and buildings blown down in the early hours of the morning. A crisis meeting of ministers called by the Home Secretary decided the emergency services were coping magnificently. In London, the wind reached 94 miles an hour, with gusts of up to 110 miles an hour in the Channel Islands. The south coast was worst affected. In Kent, 5 people died, 2 of them seamen in Dover Harbour. 2 firemen died at Highcliffe in Dorset, crushed beneath a falling tree after answering an emergency call. And at Hastings in Sussex, a man was killed by a beach hut being blown along the seafront. Elsewhere, another 5 people died in a storm first predicted last Sunday, but greatly underestimated by the experts. At noon on Wednesday, the weather system in the mid-Atlantic seems innocuous enough. By 6 p.m. that day, it's moving east. Warm air from the Azores is forced upwards, strengthening the depression beneath it. 6 o'clock yesterday morning, 2 separate centres develop. The depression starts to deepen as it enters the Bay of Biscay, but the weathermen still seem unworried.
Earlier on today, apparently, a woman rang the BBC and said she heard that there was a hurricane on the way. Well, if you're watching, don't worry, there isn't. But having said that, actually, the weather will become very windy, but most of the strong winds, incidentally, will be down over Spain and across into France.
Yesterday lunchtime, the 2 centres begin to merge, making the depression more intense. 6 o'clock last night, the storm gathers strength, forming itself into a spinning top of turbulence. Midnight, the centre of the storm west of the Channel Islands, the weathermen predicting Britain would miss the worst.
But the storms wreaked havoc across the country. The emergency services said they had little or no warning. Many roads and rail lines were blocked by fallen trees. Tonight, about 1 million people are still without electricity. The storm is now approaching the Arctic Circle, but it's left behind a trail of destruction.
There's not been a storm like this in the South Coast counties for as long as anyone can remember. Certainly the scale of the devastation hasn't been experienced since the Second World War. Houses and blocks of flats had their roofs torn away. People were rescued by firemen from buildings in danger of collapse. 2 firemen were killed answering an emergency call in Dorset when a tree fell on their cab.
2 Sussex policemen were lucky to escape when their patrol car was hit by a falling tree. This pile of flotsam is all that's left of the famous Shanklin Pier on the Isle of Wight. It had withstood channel storms for nearly a century, but last night gave up the struggle. It's the end of the pier. The owners say it wasn't insured and nobody could possibly afford to replace it. All along the south coast, there's been wholesale damage to yachts and boatyards.
The hurricane-force winds which lashed the capital in the early hours of the morning were the worst ever recorded, up to 107 miles an hour. The West End took a battering. Some department stores had their shop fronts blown out. By dawn, the winds had died down, but the damage remained. Many roads were blocked by fallen trees. Commuters were advised to stay at home. Those who didn't had to find their own way around or through obstacles. The London Fire Brigade was inundated with a record number of emergency calls. In North London, firemen rescued a woman after a chimney collapsed. She fell through every floor of the 3-storey house, but wasn't seriously hurt. Large areas of London and the southeast had power cuts. Overhead, electricity lines were blown down, forcing generating stations to be switched out of the national grid to prevent an overload. The power failures and the fact that so few city workers made it to work meant that there were almost no deals struck on either the stock exchange or the money markets. Most dealers took the opportunity to go for an early and a long lunch. Down in the Thames estuary, a crane was blown onto its side at the port of Sheerness. Troops were called in to help clear up at a devastated caravan site on the south coast. A Sea-Link ferry was blown aground near Folkestone. All 20 members of the crew are safe. There were no passengers on board. And further along the south coast, a graphic example of the power of the storm. A Sussex woodland, flattened by the wind.
At the Suffolk port of Felixstowe, the tanker, the Silver Falcon, was torn from its berth in a force 11 gale, swept out into the harbour after first smashing into a jetty. The docks were evacuated in case of an explosion. Eventually a tug was able to tow the tanker into Ipswich. At Harwich, the Home Office detention ship, the ferry Earl William, was also out of control in the Stour estuary. Tamil refugees on board had a frightening time as the ship temporarily ran aground before finding a firm anchorage. At Jaywick, 100 caravans were wrecked. Campers were evacuated to a nearby school, damage put at more than £250,000. The camp's amusement arcade reduced to a pile of rubble. On the main roads this morning, drivers weaved their way around fallen trees. A number of lorry drivers were taken to hospital, and a motorist died in an accident at King's Lynn at the height of the gales. On the region's railways, there was total disruption today. It's likely to be 48 hours before the services are fully back to normal. Tonight, the winds, still strong, are slackening, and the clear-up operation is getting into its stride.
Already, insurance companies are being contacted by thousands of people wanting to make claims, but it looks as if local councils, rather than the government, will foot the bill for clearing up the debris.
Throughout the day, council workmen across the south have been struggling to bring order back to normally peaceful suburban streets. Trees had toppled in all directions, smashing roofs, chimneys and windows. The London Borough of Ealing alone dealt with 600 calls from people whose homes or cars had been struck. The job of clearing up will take time and seriously drain council resources.
It's going to take weeks and weeks and weeks to recover from this. It's going to take an enormous amount of effort and an enormous amount of money, and I hope that we can look to the government to support us in this, because the burden on local ratepayers is going to be enormous.
The government has yet to commit itself. But for victims of the gales, the immediate worry is who pays. Storm damage to property is covered by most household policies, but there's no cover for third parties. Say if your chimney pot damages your neighbour's property, which isn't insured. And damage to fences and gates is rarely included. Insurance loss adjusters are already dealing with a stream of claims, and they say people can press ahead with repairs before the work gets authorised.
if they can get hold of a builder, all well and good. Builders are going to be very busy in the next week or so they should do what they can to protect the roof, sheet it, put polythene bags in the loft, obviously take down anything that's dangerous and hanging. The insurers will stick by them, and they're happy for them to do that.
When it comes to the many cars crushed and battered by the gales, the insurance picture looks like this. Storm damage is covered by comprehensive policies, but usually means losing part of a no-claims bonus. There's no compensation with third-party cover. Some estimates put the cost of the gales to the insurance companies and to the country at £100 million.
The weather forecasters admit they got it wrong. They'd warned of a depression approaching, but they had no idea of its strength or direction. This morning, people woke up to devastation and forecasts like this one in the Daily Telegraph. It said the weather would have an unsettled autumnal look.
Severe depressions are not uncommon at this time of year, but this was one of the severest. It began when warm, stable air from the tropics tracked across the Atlantic and met cold, unstable air coming down from the north. The cold air forced itself beneath the warm air, the whole mass generating a huge cyclone effect. But this depression was different. Where the masses of air met, the spiralling effect was encouraged by the big differences in temperature and other properties between the two air masses. This generated huge amounts of energy, which deepened the depression at the center, causing hurricane-force winds. With all this energy being generated, it was not possible to say exactly in which direction it would take itself. Weather forecasting depends on large quantities of weather information, details of temperatures, winds and so on, being fed into a large computer. The more information you get, and the more powerful the computer, the better is the forecast. Information comes from weather ships, from 8 weather stations in Britain which release balloons every 4 hours, from aircraft, and from satellites. But last night, there was simply not enough information for the computer to predict much in advance the extraordinary force of this storm.
Really, to have predicted it further ahead in great detail, we'd have needed more information midday yesterday. The midday run of the computer model yesterday, what we call a numerical model, which tries to simulate the atmosphere in terms of equations, that would have needed more information at midday yesterday.
It didn't just affect Britain. Portugal's second city, Oporto, also had major floods, and northern France had similar weather. Since the 1950s, exceptional weather events like this seem to have become more common. Some experts believe they signal a long-term change in the climate to longer, colder winters.
President Reagan called a meeting of his top-secret National Security Council today